Now that our events are available in Kafka, our next step is to begin consuming them in another microservice. In this exercise, we will switch gears and leave the ride service. Instead, we'll focus on the vehicle service. You'll want to import the vehicles project into your IDE. The goal for this exercise is to ensure that when a ride is started, we update whether the vehicle is in use. For the moment, this is a one-way trip. We'll be able to mark the vehicle as in use, but we won't have a way to mark it as not in use until we complete a later exercise. It's important to remember that this all happens asynchronously. There can be a small delay between when a user finishes the ride and when the vehicle is updated. Let's start by creating a new class. And so over in our vehicle service, we're going to go to source, main, Java, and then IO Roach Mover API. Now we're going to create a package kind of like we did over in the ride service, and we're going to call it events. So all of our events and event related things will go in here. Now, the first thing we need here is we need sort of the overall wrapper around our message. And we're going to call that a Kafka message. So this will just be named Kafka message, and it'll just be a class. So let me just very quickly paste the contents of a message into the file here, just so we have something to reference. Now you'll see that the outermost layer here is this after field. So that's what we want to deal with first. So in our Kafka message, we are going to create a private event envelope. And this event envelope is essentially going to contain everything that is in that after field. And it kind of mirrors the event envelope that we created over in the ride service. So this is going to be an event envelope. That doesn't exist yet. Don't worry about that. We're going to create that in a moment. But we're going to call this message. Now we need to annotate it, and we're going to annotate it with the @JSON property annotation. Now this actually takes a name for the field, and so what we want to do here is we want to set the value equal to after. So the name of the JSON property is going to be that after field up here. The next thing we're going to do is we're just going to add some getters and setters onto that. So we'll generate those very quickly. And that takes us to the end of our Kafka message. Now what we have to do is actually implement this event envelope. So let's go ahead and create a new Java class. And we're going to call this event envelope. And again, I'm going to copy and paste the contents of the message here just so that we can kind of see what needs to be in it. So again, looking through what we have inside of this message, we have the event data, which then consists of a bunch of different fields. We have the event type, we have an ID, and then we have a timestamp. So that's essentially what we're trying to replicate here. However, we don't necessarily need to replicate all of those fields. So what do we need? Well, we're going to need a private string, which will be event type. Again, we need to know what we're deserializing, right? So we're going to need that event type. We're going to annotate that again with the JSON property. And for the value, it's going to be equal to event type, which corresponds to the text that's actually in that message. Then we're going to want a private map of string and object. We're going to call this event data. And again, we're going to want to annotate this. So we'll annotate it with JSON property. And the value in this case will be event data, which you can see immediately above. And then remember, there's also an ID and a timestamp. But for our purposes, we don't care about the ID or the timestamp. So we're actually going to leave them out. We're just going to have the event type and the event data. Now let's go ahead and generate getters and setters for those. And that should take care of our event envelope. Dealing with a map of strings and objects is not going to be really convenient. So we want to actually create a proper ride started event in order to deal with this. So over in our events, we're going to go ahead and create a new Java class. We're going to call it ride started. Now, again, like we did before, we're going to just paste in the representation of the event right now. You can see that this intersection here is what we're dealing with, and it has a ride ID a start time, a user email, and a vehicle ID. Now, we actually don't need all of those fields. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we do need. Over in the vehicle service.java, you'll see there is a checkout vehicle, and that's what we're going to be calling when we actually implement this. And you see it requires a vehicle ID and a timestamp. So it actually doesn't take that much. So these are really the only two fields that we're actually interested in, which means we can basically ignore the other fields. So for our ride started, we're going to need a private UUID, and we'll call this vehicle ID. And we will also need a private local date time, and this will be our start time. And then we can ignore the ride ID and we can ignore the user email because we won't be using those inside of this microservice. Now, as always, let's go ahead and add our getters and setters. We'll just generate those. And that takes care of those private fields and the public getters and setters. But the other thing too is, much like we did in the ride service, we want to add a public static final string, which we're going to call event type. And then we need to give it a value. And again, remember, we are using this event type field, and you can see that that is currently set to ride started. So we want to use that here. So we're going to have ride started. And we don't need a getter and setter on that because that's public. So that takes care of our ride started event. Okay, now that we have our event all set up, we need to go over into our vehicle controller. Now, in our vehicle controller, we are going to need to actually implement a handler that will handle our Kafka messages. So down at the bottom of our class, we are going to create a new method. So this will be a public method that returns void, and we're going to name it handle ride event. Now, handle ride event will have a single parameter, which will be of type Kafka message, which we just defined. So we'll call that message. Now, this method can potentially encounter some exceptions. We're going to have it throw the not found exception. And we'll also have it throw the deserialization exception. Let's annotate this method with @Kafka listener. So this indicates that when a Kafka message is received, this will potentially handle it. Now, we need a value for topics. So we're going to set topics equal to, and we want the name of the topic that we created, which, if you remember, was mover rides.public.events. So that's the name of the topic that these messages are going to come in on. So to implement this method, we're going to start by putting in a check against the event type. So we're going to use a switch, and we will check the message.getMessage.getEventType. And then based on that event type, if it happens to be a ride started.event type, so that means that it is ride started, then we're going to perform a series of steps. And then we also want a default case. And for the default, we're just going to do a logger.warn. And we're going to warn something like Kafka received an unknown message. And then we'll want to put some details about the message. So we'll do message.getMessage.getEventType. And so that way, if we see that, then we know that there's something that we're not handling here. Now, what do we actually do for the implementation of this, assuming that we got the correct data? Well, again, first, let's do some logging just to make sure that we know when these are occurring. And we'll just log something like Kafka received and then we will just do something generic here. So we'll do ride started.event type. So we're going to essentially hard code that event type into there so that we will indicate that we have received a ride started. Now I could have just put ride started directly in there, but I wanted to do it this way just in case, over the evolution of this application, maybe we change the text of ride started. This allows me to do that without having to update it in multiple places. So that's the logging. Then what do we do with this? Well, we're going to go and we're going to need to create a ride started. So we'll name that ride started. And the way that we'll do that is we will use the Deserialize method. Now, this Deserialize method, if we just click through, it's defined over in common.java. So you can take a look at the implementation of that if you'd like. But we're going to go ahead and use that Deserialize. Then we need to pass it a mapper, which we already have in scope. That's defined up top here. So we have that mapper. So we'll go ahead and pass it the mapper. And then we need to pass it the stuff that it needs to deserialize. So in this case, that's going to be message.getMessage.getEventData. And so that grabs the data out of the message. And then the final thing is we need to tell it what to deserialize as. So we want a ridestarted.class. So that's what we're going to deserialize as. So that should theoretically take that JSON message and then convert it to a ride started. Then the only other thing that we need to do is to actually check out a vehicle. And so remember, in our vehicle service, we had a checkout vehicle, checkout vehicle, not check-in vehicle. We had a checkout vehicle, and we're going to do ride started. This takes a vehicle ID. So we want the ride started.getVehicleID, and then we want the ride started.getStartTime. And that should allow us to check out the vehicle. And then finally, we'll want a break so that we don't fall through to the default case. And that takes care of the implementation of our handle ride event. Over on our terminal, we're going to quickly run our tests. This will just take a moment to compile and run. Okay, so our tests are finished and you can see that everything passed. So that means that theoretically everything should be working at this point, but let's go ahead and actually test it in the application. So assuming everything worked, when you started up your application, it should have connected to Kafka and it should have listened for the events that were already there. Now remember, we already had 2 events in there, and so we had already checked out a couple of vehicles. It would have received those vehicles and then it would have essentially checked them out inside the vehicle service. And as a result, you get what you see here, which is 2 vehicles that are listed as unavailable. But just to make sure, let's go ahead and start from scratch. And we'll actually start a ride with a new vehicle. So we've got a total of 5. We're going to start with that 3rd one. And what we want to see is we want to see that when we go back to this vehicles page, sure enough, that has been checked out. So it looks like everything is working right now. Of course, the only problem is we can check out vehicles, but we don't actually have a way to check them back in afterwards. And so that's what we have to implement next, is we have to implement a way to actually check these vehicles back in.